My name is Ivy Bourgeot, and I've had the privilege of being the director of the Healthy Professional Worker Partnership, or HPW for short. And I really want to welcome everybody to our culminating dialogue here today. So first of all, I would like to bring greetings from Jenny Tanasco, who is an elder that has done a lot of welcomes for us. She was not able to be with us today, but wanted to bring her greetings. Jenny is an elder from Kitigan Zibi. So to provide a land acknowledgement, want to acknowledge that we are coming from all different parts of Canada, and want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the different territories of different First Nations, Inuit and Métis, some of which is covered by treaties, some of which is not. So here in Ottawa, we are located on unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation people. So we want to extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. But we want to also recognize that land acknowledgements are only one small part of disrupting the erasure of Indigenous people, their cultures, and dismantling colonial structures, of which academia is one. And so just want to acknowledge that and note how we wanted to embed that in the work that we were doing today. So just by way of overview, today we have a very packed schedule, and we can share the agenda in the chat. I also just want to welcome everybody to introduce themselves in the chat. If you would also like to say where you are coming from, acknowledging First Nations, Inuit, Métis territory that you're coming from, and I'd like to welcome you to do that in the chat. So thank you so much for doing that. This kickoff this morning will give you an overview of the HPW partnership and some of the comparative findings that were enabled by our research. And the rest of the day will be focused on the case study specific information, wealth of data that has been collected by all of the different partners. And then we will wrap up with a discussion of what we learned, what next steps, and what it has been like working on a large partnership over several years, pre and post pandemic. So I would like to also, first of all, acknowledge that the HPW partnership was in and of itself a partnership between the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so this was an initiative, a joint initiative looking at healthy and productive work. And so there were two different grants, money is coming from two different pots and many accounts. And so it was dispersed across all of these different universities that you see along here. And so at this point, I would like to introduce Jessica Nadigal, who's the Associate Scientific Director of the Institute for Health Services and Policy Research at the CIHR, to bring welcome from CIHR. Over to you, Jessica.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ivy, for inviting me to join today on behalf of CIHR. And I just wanted to acknowledge, and you started by talking about the Healthy and Productive Work Initiative, which was really launched in response to a changing Canadian workforce. And projects really need to think about how to develop, implement, and evaluate evidence-informed interventions that would support meaningful and productive work for all workers. And this was launched, and I think it was 2017. And just to say that at that time, although this was a priority for both SSHRC and CIHR, we couldn't anticipate the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that mental health, stress, burnout would be on the rise, and how it would be, like, although it was a priority before, how amplified it would be, and it became, I would say, one of the top priorities, really addressing mental health with health and all workers at CIHR. And just to say, we are thrilled that you and the entire team were ready and poised to do this work, and just really excited today to hear about some of the results. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's really wonderful to have you here. And thank you for acknowledging that our work was situated and well poised to look at what was happening during the pandemic. So by way of background, the inspiration for this work was really to seek out to understand what was shaping workplace mental health for different professional workers. We knew from previous research that we had been conducting that health professionals suffer from mental health issues. There was work that we had done in partnership with the Mental Health Commission, but we knew less so of what that was like for other professional workers, and especially how that compared. Was it particularly challenging for health professional workers in contrast to others? And although our purpose was not to compare and contrast those professional workers, we thought it would be interesting to do that to a certain extent, to understand how work context and work content did so. And so to also help address these workplace mental health issues, it's important for us to have that in-depth understanding of what are these different contributing factors, particularly from an intersectional lens. So that was explicit in the work that we were doing. So this is the model, the conceptual model that guided our work. And it took on sort of a variety of different iterations, and this is the last one, or the most recent one. And so it's intersectional in the sense that we look at an individual's different intersecting identities, whether it's their age or ability, racialized or Indigenous identity, gender in all of its different forms, and sexuality. So that's the intersectional part. And we really wanted to understand the context in terms of the organizational, work, and family influences. And again, because we were taking an intersectional gender lens, those family influences, which are often neglected, were front and center for the work that we were doing. And then we wanted to understand this path between mental health, leaves of absence, and return to work. We purposefully chose varied professional case studies. So they varied by setting in terms of some were in healthcare. So we had dentistry, medicine, midwifery, and nursing. And we had others outside of healthcare, academia, accounting, and teaching. And these case studies also varied by gender composition. So some being traditionally masculine, some being traditionally feminine. And leadership was an explicit cross-cutting focus from the beginning. So this is the team that we had our partnership, thankfully in person, in 2018. And this is how the team grew. So it had over 25 investigators, over 20 trainees over the course, and 16 different universities, which I will mention because Audrey, God love her, had to submit ethics at all of those universities for us to enable this work to be done. And including over 30 partner organizations, some of you who are here, some of you who will be coming in later on. And it's really important to note the importance of that partnership to ensure that the research that we were undertaking was meaningful to the advocacy that different organizations were doing to help structure their various initiatives going forward. So in brief, our research objectives were to understand the mental health experiences of professional workers, to understand personal, familial, work, and organizational factors, to identify how those factors influence workers' decision to either contemplate or to take a leave of absence, and included some understanding of what the barriers and facilitators were. We wanted to identify also the factors that facilitate or create barriers to return to work, and to identify different levels of intervention that facilitate healthy return to work. Now, we didn't initially want to sort of understand the impact of the pandemic because the pandemic came upon us just as we were about to collect data. So that meant that we had to regroup and figure out how we were going to assess what was happening in real time. So that was something that came on afterwards. So from the fall of 2020, late fall 2020 to fall of 2021, roughly, we undertook an enormous amount of document analysis just to really understand what we were going to be collecting would be value add. We had surveys with over 3,000 workers, interviews, very in-depth interviews with over 282 participants. So from a qualitative study perspective, this is enormous. And a number of the participants will speak to the richness of these data and also the challenges in collecting those data while we were also undergoing the pandemic. And then stakeholder interviews, folks in unions, professional associations, educational institutions, regulatory authorities, employers, etc. So it's an enormous amount of data. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the structure of the survey, because many of the other presentations that will follow really speak to the richness of the qualitative data. So the way that the survey was structured, because it was the same survey for all of the different professional groups, they came in and they would identify what the profession was, and then they were filtered into a set of questions, many of which were common. We had a cluster of questions that looked at their experiences of this pathway from mental health, leaves of absence, return to work, and that was over their life course. So that's ever that they had ever experienced that. And then we had a set of questions that asked about stress and mental health, distress, burnout, presenteeism, both during the pandemic and then having them recall back to what it was like a year prior, so before the pandemic. And then we had individual demographic and family characteristics. And so this enabled us to visualize the data in this way. So these are the pathway data that you can see in terms of identifying that they experienced a mental health issue, made changes to their work, considered a leave of absence, actually took a leave of absence, and of those that took a leave of absence, how many returned to work. So what you can see here across the different professions is some similarities. And so, for example, dentistry, medicine, midwifery had very low rates of taking a leave of absence. And also what we will also see is lower rates of returning to work. And so that enables us to look across different professions. And it also enables us to look across different professions in terms of their predominance of women. So what's the situation like, for example, for nursing and midwifery and education workers in terms of their experience of mental health? We were also able to look at, and this is just comparing within health professionals, some of the factors that facilitate and acted as barriers to return to work, because we had a much smaller sample size. For those who return to work, we clustered them all together. And so here it's important to note supportive colleagues really figured prominently, both in terms of facilitators and unsupportive colleagues for barriers. And the same thing in regards to supervisors. So relationships matter, your work context matters. And so that was really notable. And we were really pleased for this research that was published in Healthcare Management Forum to win the award for Article of the Year. And this is some of our amazing group members. This was actually the first time that I met in person Henrietta, although we had been working for many years. And it was really nice for Healthcare Management Forum to kind of call out to say how this work calls on those in leadership roles to take an explicit profession and gender-based approach, recognizing the influences of individual work and family circumstances on workers' mental health. And so at this point, I'm going to pass over to Henrietta, who has been our survey analyst. She's based in Alberta, and she's coming to us very early this morning. So Henrietta, I will pass to you, and I'll just continue to go through the slides.
Thank you, Ivy. Because we had a large survey sample, we were able to undertake analysis on the pathway for mental health to leave of absence and return to work for BIPOC and non-BIPOC professional workers. The pathway analysis revealed that rates for BIPOC professionals were lower across board and being significantly less likely to take a leave of absence. Further, taking an explicit intersectional analysis, we found that compared to non-BIPOC men, BIPOC women were 64% more likely to report mental health issues, whereas BIPOC men were 40% less likely to report mental health issues. And although the findings were not significant, we found that BIPOC men and women were less likely to take a leave of absence. They were also less likely to return to work after taking a leave of absence compared to non-BIPOC men, with BIPOC men 10% less likely and BIPOC women 40% less likely to return to work. Next, we did a Sankey diagram that we compared the ratings of distress from pre-COVID to during COVID. And not surprisingly, we found that distress went up for all professions during COVID, especially those where women predominate. So that is nursing, teaching, and midwifery. And similarly for burnout, with medicine also being in the top 3. When taking BIPOC and non-BIPOC identity into consideration, we found higher levels of distress reported among BIPOC professional workers. But interestingly, lower rates of burnout. I'll pass it over to Ivy for the next few slides.
Thank you, Henrietta. So what was really incredible was our ability to really understand and take that intersectional analysis because we had such a large sample size. There were also really important findings that we looked at by non-binary gender identity that, again, we were able to cluster together and really understand those identities beyond just sort of the binary male-female. So at this point, so understanding this uniquely intersectional pathway of the experiences of professional workers can better enable more targeted and effective interventions to sustain workplace wellness, one of our key objectives. And moreover, the intersectional impact of the pandemic on the mental health of professional workers has been significant and felt particularly by women and in those professions where women predominate. So again, really speaking to the importance of an intersectional lens. So these differences that we found in the survey data and the rich qualitative data went into the creation of a set of intersectionally informed toolkits that Jelena will speak to later on today. But one may be asking at this point, how have things changed since we collected those data in late 2020, early 2021? So I'm now going to pass back to Henrietta, who can walk us through findings from a follow-up survey undertaken earlier this year, for which you are the first to see these preliminary results.
Thank you, Ivy. The follow-up survey was taken this year, and we compared the data from this survey to the data from the previous survey. In the 2021 survey, we asked whether respondents will be willing to volunteer for a follow-up survey. And 1,388 did, of which 799 responded. The 2024 survey followed the same format with fewer questions and 2 notable time differences. Since 2021, for the pathway and in the last 4 weeks for self-reported mental health indicators. Here you can see the differences in the pathway for the volunteer respondents only from 2021 and 2024. A slightly higher proportion reported experiencing mental health issues and making changes to work in 2021. Fewer considered taking a leave of absence, of which 53% returned to work since 2021. This notable difference could be due to the shorter time frame that we had in the initial survey. In these 3-part Sankey diagram indicating prior to the pandemic in 2021 and 2024, it shows how distress scores have not fully recovered to the pre-pandemic levels. Gender differences persist, with women reporting higher distress at all time periods. Burnout scores have recovered even less compared to the pandemic levels. Gender differences persist, with women reporting more burnout, particularly in the last 2 time periods. We see a similar trend in work stress, where, again, women reported higher, and even though they have recovered, it hasn't to the pre-pandemic levels. And finally, for non-work stress, we see the same trend. Women are reporting higher non-work stress levels. They've all recovered, but again, not to pre-pandemic levels. I'll pass it back to Ivy for the wrap-up.
So I can imagine many of these findings are very interesting, and we are still starting to work out the full details of how this is, what all the implications are. So please stay tuned for more comparative findings by connecting with us on our social media. And this is a little logo, and I think many of the other presenters will be showing that later on in the presentation. So with this, I'd like to open it up for questions and comments, and first passing this back to Jessica to moderate the Q&A. So thank you so much.